The generals laughed. The politicians scoffed. The male pilots shook their heads with the kind of dismissive certainty that came from centuries of tradition. Women, they insisted, lacked the physical strength to handle heavy aircraft. They would panic under pressure. Their emotional nature would make them liabilities in the sky. The cockpit of a military aircraft was no place for a woman. And yet, by the time World War II ended, over 1,100 American women had proven every single one of those assumptions catastrophically wrong. They delivered 12,650 aircraft across the continental United States. They flew 60 million miles in military service. They piloted every single type of aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory, from nimble trainers to massive four-engine bombers, from temperamental pursuit planes that had killed experienced male pilots to experimental aircraft so dangerous that men had refused to fly them. 38 of them paid the ultimate price in service to their country. And then, in one of the greatest injustices of the war, their government erased them from history. This is the story of the women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASPs, and the extraordinary chapter of World War II that the United States military tried to forget. The year was 1941, and the skies over Europe were burning. Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe had brought Britain to its knees during the Blitz, raining incendiary bombs on London night after night. The Royal Air Force was hemorrhaging pilots faster than training programs could replace them. Across the Atlantic, American military planners watched with growing unease. In December of that year, everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941, killed thousands of Americans and destroyed the Pacific Fleet. Within days, the United States was at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy simultaneously. The American military, which had been cautiously expanding, now faced a mobilization challenge unlike anything in the nation's history. The numbers were staggering. The Army Air Forces needed pilots, tens of thousands of them. They needed men to fly bombers over Germany and Japan, to escort those bombers with fighter aircraft, to conduct reconnaissance missions, to transport cargo and personnel. But here was the problem that few people discussed publicly. For every pilot sent overseas to fight, several more were needed stateside to perform domestic flying duties. Aircraft had to be ferried from factories to modification centers, then to training bases, then to ports of embarkation. Trainers had to tow aerial gunnery targets so that anti-aircraft crews could practice. Aircraft had to be tested after maintenance. Every qualified male pilot performing these domestic duties was a pilot who couldn't be fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Every hour a combat-trained aviator spent ferrying a trainer from a Texas factory to a Florida base was an hour he wasn't spending preparing to face the Luftwaffe. The math simply didn't work. By mid-1942, Army Air Forces Commanding General Henry Harley Hap Arnold was facing a crisis. The relentless demand for combat pilots overseas was draining the pool of qualified aviators available for domestic missions. Training programs were at maximum capacity. Draft boards were pulling young men into the military faster than the system could process them. And every aircraft coming off American assembly lines needed a pilot to ferry it to its destination. General Arnold understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the military establishment, that desperate times required unconventional solutions. And in the spring of 1942, two remarkable women presented him with exactly that. Jacqueline Cochran was not a woman who accepted limitations. Born in poverty so crushing that she had walked barefoot until she was 8 years old, Cochran had clawed her way out of sawmill camps in northern Florida through sheer force of will. She had worked as a hairdresser, built a cosmetics empire, and along the way discovered that she could fly. Not just fly faster and higher and farther than almost anyone else alive. By 1942, Cochran held more speed, altitude, and distance records than any pilot in history, male or female. She had won the prestigious Bendix Trophy race in 1938, becoming the first woman to do so. She had set the women's national altitude record at 33,000 feet. She had flown experimental aircraft that had terrified men with twice her experience. When she walked into a room, people noticed. When she spoke, generals listened. Cochrane had seen the pilot shortage coming before Pearl Harbor. In 1941, she had personally led a group of 25 American women pilots to Britain, where they joined the Air Transport Auxiliary, the organization ferrying aircraft for the Royal Air Force. These women had proven conclusively that female pilots could handle military aircraft. Now Cochrane wanted to bring that model home. Her vision was ambitious: a women's flying training program that would produce graduates capable of performing any domestic flying mission, freeing male pilots for combat duty overseas. But she was not alone in her thinking. Nancy Harkness Love approached the problem from a different angle. Tall and elegant, with a calm, methodical demeanor that contrasted sharply with Cochrane's volcanic energy, Love was the daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia physician. She had learned to fly at 16, earned her pilot's license at 16 and a half, and by the time war broke out, she had accumulated over 1,200 flying hours, more than many commercial airline captains. Love's idea was more immediate and more practical than Cochrane's grand training vision. She proposed recruiting women who were already experienced pilots, the estimated 3,000 American women who held pilots' licenses in 1942, and putting them to work immediately ferrying aircraft. No extensive training program, no bureaucratic delays, just qualified pilots doing essential work right now. In September 1942, with General Arnold's cautious blessing, Love was authorized to create the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. She began with 28 carefully selected women pilots, each with at least 500 hours of flying time. Meanwhile, Cochrane received approval for her own organization, the Women's Flying Training Detachment. This program would take women with less flying experience and put them through an intensive military flight training course. Two programs, two visionaries, two approaches to the same desperate problem. Eventually, they would merge into a single organization, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASPs. But first, before any rivalry could develop, before any jealousy could take root, these women had to prove something that the military establishment still doubted. They had to prove they could fly. The washout rate was staggering. Of every 100 women who entered training at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, fewer than half would earn their wings. The program was designed that way. Cochrane had no interest in graduating pilots who were merely adequate. She wanted aviators who could handle anything, and she was willing to fail as many women as necessary to ensure that every graduate met that standard. The reasons for elimination were numerous and unforgiving: failure to master instrument flying, inability to recover from spins, consistent errors in navigation, physical ailments that grounded trainees before they could complete the curriculum. Some washed out on their first solo flight, the moment when an instructor climbed out of the rear cockpit and left a trainee alone in an aircraft for the first time. Others made it months into the program before a failed check ride ended their dreams. Because death came to Avenger Field. March 7, 1943. The sky over Sweetwater was clear and cold. It was good flying weather, the kind of morning that made pilots eager to climb into their cockpits and feel the freedom of the air. Margaret Oldenburg was 23 years old, a member of Class 43W2. She was pretty and blonde, with a bright smile that made friends easily. She had mastered the PT-19. She had conquered the demanding BT-13. She was preparing to transition to the AT-6, the final step before graduation. That morning, she climbed into a BT-13 for what should have been a routine training flight. The details of what happened next were never entirely clear. Witnesses on the ground saw her aircraft enter a spin at approximately 2,000 feet altitude, a maneuver that every trainee practiced repeatedly. But this time, something went wrong. The aircraft continued spinning, falling toward the earth in tight, violent rotations. Margaret never recovered. The BT-13 struck the ground 3 miles southeast of the airfield. Margaret Oldenburg died on impact, becoming the first fatality in the women's flying training program. The training continued that afternoon. Cochrane's response to the tragedy set a pattern that would hold for the remainder of the war. There would be no special memorial services during duty hours. There would be no extended mourning periods. There would be no allowances for grief to interfere with the mission. But Cochrane also understood the human cost. When Margaret Oldenburg died, the military refused to pay for transporting her body home to her family in North Dakota. As civilian employees, the women in the training program had no official military status. The trainees were not entitled to military death benefits. There was no government insurance, no military funeral, no flag for the family. Cochrane paid for the transport herself. It would not be the last time. The women of Class 43W2 took up a collection among themselves, gathering what money they could spare from their meager trainee allowances. They sent flowers and letters of condolence. They mourned their fallen classmate in their barracks at night, crying quietly so as not to disturb those trying to sleep. And in the morning, they went back to the flight line. By the summer of 1943, the program had proven its value beyond any reasonable doubt. The WASPs had expanded from their original base to establish ferrying squadrons at airfields across the country. Women pilots were now stationed at Long Beach Army Airfield in California, at Dallas Love Field in Texas, at Romulus Army Airfield in Michigan. They were delivering trainers, transports, and increasingly combat aircraft. In March 1943, Nancy Love herself became the first woman to fly a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the massive four-engine heavy bomber that was the backbone of the 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The B-17G model she flew had a wingspan of nearly 104 feet, weighed over 36,000 pounds empty, and required a crew of 10 to operate in combat. Love handled it with the same cool proficiency she brought to everything she flew. The achievement shattered another barrier. If women could fly the B-17, they could fly anything. Meanwhile, graduates of the training program were flooding into operational units, taking on missions that went far beyond simple ferry flights. They were towing targets for anti-aircraft gunnery training, a mission that involved dragging a fabric banner behind their aircraft while ground crews shot live ammunition at it. They were testing aircraft that had just come out of maintenance, verifying that mechanics had properly repaired battle damage. The aircraft the WASPs flew read like a catalog of American military aviation. Primary trainers like the Fairchild PT-19, pursuit aircraft like the Bell P-39 Airacobra, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the North American P-51 Mustang. Bombers like the Douglas A-20 Havoc, the Martin B-26 Marauder, and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. By the end of the war, WASPs had flown every single type of aircraft in the Army Air Force's inventory, 77 different models in all. Some of these aircraft were docile and forgiving, others were notorious widowmakers. The Martin B-26 Marauder, a twin-engine medium bomber, had earned the nickname Widowmaker early in its service life due to its high accident rate during training. Its stubby wings and high wing loading meant it had to maintain higher speeds than other bombers, and it was unforgiving of pilot error during takeoff and landing. Male pilots had refused to fly it. Squadrons had experienced morale crises. The aircraft had nearly been canceled. The Air Force came up with a psychological trick. They sent the WASPs to fly it. At Dodge City Army Airfield in Kansas, female pilots took over B-26 training and demonstration duties, showing male pilots that the aircraft could be flown safely if handled correctly. They put the Marauder through its paces, demonstrating takeoffs and landings, performing the maneuvers that had terrified male crews. Their example helped restore confidence in the aircraft and saved the B-26 program from cancellation. The hours accumulated, the miles stretched into millions, and the WASPs became an indispensable part of the American war machine. They ferried pursuit planes from factories in California to modification centers in New Jersey, crossing the continent in single-seat fighters with no co-pilot, no navigator, no one to help if something went wrong. They towed targets for anti-aircraft training, feeling the thump and vibration as live rounds passed within yards of their aircraft. They tested aircraft with known mechanical problems, planes that experienced mechanics had flagged as unsafe. planes that needed to be flown to verify that repairs had been successful. They knew that every test flight might be their last, that a failed repair could mean a fire or a structural failure or a control system that stopped responding at the worst possible moment. They flew radio-controlled target drones, guiding the pilotless aircraft while other pilots practiced shooting them down. They flew engineering test missions for experimental equipment, serving as guinea pigs for systems that had never been proven in flight. And through it all, they dealt with prejudice, hostility, and institutional resistance that would have broken lesser spirits. The hostility came from every direction. Male pilots resented them. Ground crews sabotaged them. Commanding officers ignored them. The sabotage was the most dangerous. At bases across the country, WASPs discovered that their aircraft had been tampered with before flights. Sugar in fuel tanks, loosened engine bolts, control cables that had been partially cut, oil lines with pinholes drilled into them. Each act of sabotage was potentially lethal, designed to cause mechanical failure in flight, where even minor malfunctions could prove fatal. The perpetrators were rarely caught. The military police investigated, filed reports, and closed cases without arrests. The women learned to conduct their own pre-flight inspections with obsessive thoroughness, checking every system twice, trusting nothing, assuming that someone wanted them to die. Some of the sabotage was motivated by simple misogyny. Men who believed that women had no place in military aviation and were willing to kill to enforce that belief. Some came from male pilots who feared that the WASP success would cost them their safe stateside assignments and send them into combat overseas. The military's official position was that the sabotage incidents were isolated, unconnected, the work of disturbed individuals rather than evidence of systematic resistance. The WASPs knew better. They flew anyway. The discrimination extended far beyond sabotage. WASPs had no military status. Despite wearing uniforms, despite following military regulations, despite taking orders from military officers, they remained civilian employees of the Army Air Forces. They received no military benefits, no GI Bill educational assistance when the war ended, no Veterans Administration health care, no access to military housing. When they were injured in the line of duty, they paid their own medical bills. When they died, their families received nothing. The pay disparity was equally stark. A WASP earned significantly less than male officers with equivalent flying duties. Male pilots also received flight pay, housing allowances, and other supplements that WASPs were denied. Transportation was a constant humiliation. WASPs were not permitted to fly on military aircraft as passengers, even when traveling on official orders. They had to purchase commercial tickets out of their own pockets, then submit paperwork for reimbursement that sometimes took months to process. The social dynamics were treacherous. Any woman seen as too friendly with male personnel risked being labeled promiscuous. Any woman seen as too cold risked being called a man-hater. Any woman who complained about discrimination risked being labeled a troublemaker and washed out on pretextual grounds. And they kept dying. The death toll mounted throughout 1943 and 1944. Mabel Rawlinson died on August 23, 1943, when her AT-6 trainer crashed during a night flying exercise at Camp Davis, North Carolina. She was 26 years old. Witnesses reported that her aircraft appeared to be functioning normally until moments before impact. Margaret Sape died on September 2, 1943, when her A-24 Banshee dive bomber crashed during a routine training mission. She was 25 years old. Some of her fellow WASPs suspected sabotage, noting that several aircraft at Camp Davis had experienced suspicious mechanical failures in the weeks before her death. The names accumulated like a grim roll call: Dorothy Nichols, Hazel Wying Lee, Marie Mitchell Robinson, Evelyn Sharp, who had been flying since she was 15, who had set speed records and won air races, who died at 24 when her P-38 Lightning crashed near Middletown, Pennsylvania. Each death was a tragedy. Each death was also a test. The military establishment watched closely, waiting for the women to break. waiting for the casualty rate to climb to the point where even supporters would have to admit that women couldn't handle military aviation. The WASPs refused to give them that satisfaction. The 38 women who died in service to the WASP program represented a fatality rate of approximately 3.6%, slightly lower than the fatality rate for male pilots performing equivalent domestic duties. The women were not dying because they couldn't fly. They were dying because military aviation was dangerous for everyone. But the military's indifference to these deaths was staggering. When a WASP died, the Army Air Forces did not transport her body home. Her family received no death gratuity, no insurance payment, no official acknowledgement that she had died in service to her country. Her name was not read into any official record of military casualties. She was not eligible for burial in a military cemetery. Her fellow WASPs were expected to continue flying as if nothing had happened. So the WASPs took care of their own. When a woman died, her classmates pooled their money to send the body home. They wrote letters to grieving families. They kept the names of the fallen alive in their memories. The missions grew more dangerous as 1944 progressed. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, WASPs flew engineering test missions for the Army Air Forces Materiel Command. They pushed aircraft to their limits, testing new equipment installations, evaluating modifications, gathering data that would help engineers improve performance and safety. At bases throughout the South, WASPs continued towing targets for gunnery training. The anti-aircraft crews on the ground were learning to shoot down enemy aircraft, and they needed realistic targets to practice on. The WASPs flew those targets. Fabric banners trailed behind their aircraft on long cables, while the gunners below fired live ammunition. WASPs reported bullets passing within feet of their cockpits. They landed with holes in their wings, their fuselages, their tail surfaces. They returned from missions with shattered windscreens, damaged control surfaces, hydraulic lines severed by stray rounds. The official reports called these incidents near misses. The pilots called them something less printable. At Camp Davis, the situation was particularly grim. The base had earned a reputation as the most dangerous assignment in the program. The anti-aircraft units training there were using weapons ranging from .50 caliber machine guns to 90 anti-aircraft guns. Betty Taylor would have been one of the first WASPs to die at Camp Davis. She would not be the last. The logic was simple and brutal. Trained combat pilots were too valuable to risk on target towing duties. Every man lost to a gunnery training accident was a man who couldn't fly missions over Germany or Japan. The WASPs were expendable in a way that combat-bound male pilots were not. The women understood this calculus. They accepted it. They flew anyway. By the spring of 1944, the women Airforce Service Pilots had proven themselves beyond any reasonable doubt. Over 900 women were now serving in the program. They had flown millions of miles. They had delivered thousands of aircraft. They had freed thousands of male pilots for combat duty overseas. And still, they had no military status. Jacqueline Cochran had been fighting for militarization since the program's inception. In February 1944, her lobbying efforts finally seemed to be bearing fruit. General Arnold formally recommended that the WASPs be brought into the military. Representative John Costello of California introduced a bill to make it happen. Then everything fell apart. The opposition came from an unexpected direction: male civilian flight instructors. These were pilots who had been training military aviators at bases across the country. But as the war turned in the Allies' favor, the Army Air Forces began to wind down its training programs. Fewer new pilots were needed. The civilian instructors faced unemployment. Their solution was simple. If the WASPs were disbanded and their jobs given to civilian male pilots, there would be enough work to go around. The instructors organized quickly. They argued that giving military status to women while male pilots faced unemployment was a betrayal. They flooded Congress with letters claiming that the women were just looking for excitement and taking jobs from men with families. The campaign was effective. The press picked up the story, framing it as a conflict between veterans and privileged women. Editorial cartoons depicted WASPs as frivolous socialites playing at being pilots. The tide had turned. General Arnold fought back, testifying before Congress that the WASPs had freed male pilots for combat and that their accident rate was comparable to men. But his testimony was insufficient. On June 21, 1944, the House of Representatives defeated the bill to militarize the WASPs. The margin was just 19 votes. The WASPs would remain civilians. They would receive no military benefits, no veteran status, no official recognition of their service. They had given everything, and their government had decided they deserved nothing. But there was worse news to come. On October 1, 1944, General Arnold sent a telegram to all WASP units. The message was brief and devastating. The Women Airforce Service Pilots program would be deactivated on December 20, 1944. The women had less than 3 months to go home. The reaction was a mixture of shock, grief, and fury. Many had been flying for over 2 years, had built their lives around the program, had sacrificed everything. Now they were being discarded like worn-out equipment. The official explanation, that male pilots were now available, was technically accurate but deeply misleading. The real reason was political. The Army Air Forces had decided to cut its losses. On December 20, 1944, the Women Air Force Service Pilots officially ceased to exist. There was no ceremony, no formal dismissal, no acknowledgement that something historic was ending. Women simply turned in their equipment, signed their discharge papers, and walked off the bases where they had served. They were given no military discharge papers because they had never been in the military. They received no veterans' benefits. They were not eligible for the GI Bill. They could not receive treatment at Veterans Administration hospitals even for injuries sustained in the line of duty. They went home as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't spent years proving that women could fly. The silence that followed deactivation was almost complete. The WASPs' records were classified and sealed. The women were not mentioned in official histories of World War II. Their contributions were not taught in schools. Their existence was, for all practical purposes, erased from the national memory. Some women continued to fly after the war, but they faced the same discrimination that had plagued them during their service. Airlines refused to hire female pilots regardless of their qualifications. Flight schools preferred male instructors. Others put away their flight suits and never spoke of their service. They married, raised families, pursued careers in fields unrelated to aviation. They kept their WASP experiences private, sometimes not even telling their own children that they had once flown military aircraft across the country. For over 30 years, they remained forgotten. And then in the 1970s, something unexpected happened. The United States Air Force announced that it would begin training female pilots for the first time. The press coverage was extensive, celebrating this historic first as a breakthrough for women's equality. The surviving WASPs watched the coverage with a mixture of emotions. Pride, certainly, but also frustration, even anger, that their own achievements were being ignored. They had flown military aircraft 30 years earlier, and now the Air Force was pretending that female military pilots were something new. It was time to set the record straight. The woman who would lead the fight was Colonel Bruce Arnold, son of the legendary General Hap Arnold. He had contacted several surviving WASPs to alert them to the Air Force's publicity campaign. He was as outraged as they were by the erasure of history. The women began organizing. B. Falk Haydu, a former WASP who had ferried aircraft across the country, joined with other survivors to demand official recognition as military veterans. The task seemed impossible. The WASP's records remained classified. Most Americans had never heard of the program. But the WASPs had spent their entire service being told that something was impossible, and then doing it anyway. They wrote to Congress, they wrote to newspapers, and they found allies. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, a pilot in World War II who had flown with WASPs, became a passionate advocate. These women flew the same planes, took the same risks, and died doing the same duty as their male counterparts, Goldwater declared on the Senate floor. They deserve the recognition that has been denied them for over 30 years. The opposition was fierce. Veterans organizations initially opposed the legislation, arguing that granting veteran status to the WASPs would dilute the meaning of military service. But the breakthrough came when the WASPs' classified records were finally unsealed in 1977. The records confirmed everything the women had claimed. The numbers were staggering: 1,074 women, 60 million miles flown, 38 deaths. The accident rate for female pilots had been lower than for male pilots. The evidence was overwhelming. The WASPs had not only served, they had served with distinction. On November 23, 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed the law granting the women Airforce Service Pilots official veteran status. 33 years after deactivation, the WASPs were finally recognized. The surviving WASPs gathered to celebrate at reunions across the country. Women who had kept their service secret for decades finally felt free to speak. Families learned for the first time that their mothers and grandmothers had flown military aircraft. But the recognition came too late for many. Of the 1,074 women who had served, only about 850 were still living in 1977. The others had died without ever being acknowledged as veterans. The 38 who had died during the war remained in an especially painful limbo. Their families had received no death benefits, no military funerals, no flags. Victory was bittersweet. The recognition in 1977 was just the beginning. Over the following decades, the WASPs received a series of honors. In 2009, Congress passed legislation awarding the WASPs the Congressional Gold Medal. The medal ceremony was held on March 10, 2010 in the Capitol Rotunda. Over 200 surviving WASPs attended. They were in their 80s and 90s now, arriving in wheelchairs and with walkers. They wore their Santiago blue jackets with the WASP wings pinned to their chests. Speaker Nancy Pelosi addressed them directly. "Your actions helped save the world for democracy. You are American patriots." But there was still one battle left to fight. When WASP Elaine Harmon died in 2015 at the age of 95, her family discovered that the Army had ruled that WASPs were not eligible for interment at Arlington National Cemetery. Despite being veterans, despite the Congressional Gold Medal, Elaine Harmon was being denied even in death. Her granddaughter, Erin Miller, refused to accept this decision. She launched a massive campaign, gathering petitions and shamming the military on national television. In 2016, Congress passed legislation explicitly guaranteeing WASPs the right to be interned at Arlington, overriding the Army's policy. On September 7, 2016, Elaine Harmon was finally laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Taps was played. The flag was folded. And finally, the United States government did what it should have done in 1944. It saluted. The legacy of the WASP extends far beyond their individual achievements. They proved, conclusively and permanently, that women could fly military aircraft at the highest levels. Every female pilot who followed, every woman who flew combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, every woman who commanded a squadron, built upon the foundation the WASPs had laid. Lieutenant Colonel Eileen Collins, the first female space shuttle commander, carried a WASP scarf into space. Major General Jeannie Leavitt, the Air Force's first female fighter pilot, spoke often of the debt she owed them. The story of the women Air Force Service Pilots is a story about what happens when extraordinary people refuse to accept arbitrary limitations. 1,074 women looked at a world that told them they couldn't fly combat planes and flew them anyway. They looked at a military that didn't want them and served anyway. They looked at a society that tried to erase them and made sure they would be remembered anyway. On a wall at the National WASP World War II Museum in Sweetwater, Texas, A plaque bears a simple inscription that captures the essence of everything these women accomplished. We live in the wind and sand, and our eyes are on the stars. These words speak to the transcendent nature of what the women experienced. They lived in harsh conditions, faced brutal challenges, endured discrimination and death. But through it all, their eyes remained fixed on something higher. They did prove themselves. They proved it beyond any possibility of doubt. The skies above Sweetwater are quiet now. The training aircraft no longer buzz overhead. The runways are cracked and weathered, but if you stand on that airfield at sunset, you can almost hear them. You can almost hear the engines roaring to life. You can almost hear the determined voices of young women who refused to believe that anything was impossible. They said women couldn't fly combat planes. 1,074 women Air Force Service Pilots said otherwise, and they proved it, one flight at a time, until no one could deny the truth any longer. They were American heroes. They deserved to be remembered, and now at last they are.